Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everyone from wherever you are joining us in the world today. LGC's Dr. Ehrenstorfer is thrilled to be hosting this webinar and panel event today on the detection of counterfeit agrochemicals in collaboration with University College London. My name is Dr. Kelly Cheshire. I am the Global Product Manager for LGC, and I'll be giving you a brief introduction to LGC and Dr. Ehrenstorfer shortly. I'm also joined by Dr. Rob Moss from University College London, and he'll be giving you an introduction to UCL and the research project that he and his wider team have been working on, and then we'll head into our panel discussion where you can ask the panel members the questions most important to you. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. There is a menu to the right-hand side of your screen, or possibly to the left if you've moved it, in which there's a chat box available for you to submit your questions to the panel members. And you can start submitting your questions from now right up until the end of the event today. If there are any questions we're unable to answer in the panel event, we'll follow up with you as soon as the event is finished. Just to let you know, the event is being recorded, so if you do miss anything for any reason, you can catch up on that, and we will be sharing the recording shortly after the event. If you do have any issues with audio, there are audio options in that menu as well, so you can join through your computer audio or through a telephone. There are details in that menu and also in the invite that was sent to you. And just to point out, in the recording that we send after that, we also have all of our contact details available for the panel members and for us at Dr. Ehrenstorfer. So you can submit any of your questions after the event as well, should you have missed the opportunity to today. And so without further ado, I'm going to kickstart this presentation. So this is Dr. Ehrenstorfer presents on-site detection systems for illegal agrochemicals. And that's in collaboration with University College London's Department of Medical Physics and Biomedical Engineering. And this project has been funded by the Door Centre for Future Crime, also hosted at UCL. So just to give you a little bit of a background to UCL for those less familiar, our history goes back as far as 1842, believe it or not, and that's where we were first established as the laboratory of the Board of Excise. And that was to protect excise duty payable on tobacco importation into the UK. It then evolved to take on a special function that was known as the referee analyst, and that was in order to protect consumer safety, and that's a function we still house today. Back in 1996, LGC was privatised, and our evolution did not stop there. We've continued to grow both organically and through acquisitions. We're now serving over 160 countries. We have 27 offices and 15 production sites globally, with over 300,000 products to offer and to address a range of different needs. And that also includes our Dr. Ehrenstorfer range of comprehensive, high-quality reference materials. Now, Dr. Ehrenstorfer joined the LGC group in 2012, but its history goes back further than that, having over 45 years of experience in producing reference materials. First established in Germany in 1975, and since then has led the way in pesticide reference material production for food, environmental, and cannabis testing industries. Our portfolio now houses over 12,000 catalogue items, and not just pesticides, it also includes pharmaceutical and veterinary residues, PFAS compounds, and standards to support regulatory methods. We have a range of different formats available, including neat, single solutions and mixtures, and also different product types, so metabolites, stable isotope label compounds, and our native compounds to suit your individual needs. Nearly half of which of this portfolio is accredited to ISO 17034 standards, giving our customers the confidence it needs in their analyses when using our materials. And since joining LGC in 2012, Dr. Ehrenstorfer has expanded and now has 3 centres of excellence globally, and that's in Charleston, US, Nanjing, China, and of course, where it all started, in Augsburg, Germany. We also have the ability to create custom standards to meet varying and unique needs of our customers, and that's thanks to having over 10,000 neat materials on stock. And we are thrilled today that our portfolio has been able to support the research project that UCL are conducting. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Rob, who will be able to talk you through this project further. Over to you, Rob.
Thanks, Kelly, for the introduction. And yeah, so I thought I would start by giving you a bit of an intro to UCL and then give you a bit of background to the project before then talking a bit about the technical achievements. So UCL, University College London, it was established in 1826 by Jeremy Bentham. Depending on the world rankings, it's consistently ranked in the top 10 universities in the world. And in the last large research excellence framework assessment, UCL was ranked first in the UK for research strength. I'm from the Department of Medical Physics and Biomedical Engineering, which is the oldest, one of the oldest medical physics departments in the world. And also joining us is the Department of Security and Crime Science, which hosts the Door Centre for Future Crime, who funded this work. So we have a panel of experts today, and this includes myself, Dr. JC Kong, Professor Robert Speller, and Professor Shane Johnson. We're all from UCL. Also Dr. Richard Byrne and Dr. Martin Hare from Harper Adams, who have been advising on the project, and Dr. Kelly Cheshire, who you've just met, and Dr. Jens Seltman from LGC Group. So a bit of background to the project. I suppose it started quite a number of years ago now, when we were doing a project to look at detecting counterfeit pharmaceuticals using a technique called X-ray diffraction. And sort of the interest in counterfeit products grew out of that, and we then were funded by the Door Centre to undertake a sandpit event where we were looking more broadly at future trends in counterfeit chemical products. And the scope of that was broadened to include pharmaceuticals, but also food and drink, agrochemicals, and cosmetics. And in that sandpit event, we assembled experts from industry, academia, and government. And we had a two-day event where we were aiming to look at the problems that counterfeits present in these spaces and how they manifest, and then start to think about technological solutions that might allow us to counter those problems. And maybe, I suppose, a surprising outcome from that for me was that actually the proliferation of illegal agrochemicals is actually a major problem. With frequent reports in the grey literature, although it's hard to come across any particular concrete evidence. But it was also apparent that it's a largely neglected problem, particularly from the research side. And of course, you know, trade in illegal agrochemicals has impact on a number of people. And firstly, you could think of the impact on chemical companies due to reputational damage and perhaps IP infringement. And of course, it damages farming, transport and leisure sectors where people may start to lose trust. But also probably on the sharp end, you know, there's the potential for it to harm human and animal health, to damage crop or damage crop yields, and also potentially affect and damage the environment at large. So I wanted to kind of clarify this term that we've used, this illegal agrochemicals. We've sort of categorized this into four groups. There's counterfeits, which are things that pretend to be something that they're not. There's substandard chemicals, so these may be genuine product, or they may contain the correct sort of ingredients, but they've been in some way doctored, which means that they're no longer as effective as the real product should be. There could be banned. So these are things that used to be allowed to be used in the UK or Europe, for example, but are no longer allowed to be used. And then there's unauthorized. So these might be chemicals that are allowed to be used in other parts of the world. So they're freely, you know, they can be traded, but they are not chemicals that can be used in the UK, for example. And looking at some of the literature, the suggestion is that this accounts for of the order of 10% of the UK market, of the EU market, sorry, around about 1.3 billion euros per year. Quite possibly accounts for a much larger fraction of the market in other parts of the world. The prevalence of counterfeit or substandard agrochemicals has increased in the last decade, and actually it appears to be a growing criminal enterprise. And this could be understood if you look at this chart here, where we have global pesticide usage plotted out over the last quarter of a century. And we can see in that time period, the usage has roughly doubled. So we can see that there's real scope for criminal growth in this area. And I suppose that also made us start thinking about, why is this a good criminal activity? And from what we understand, the barriers are fairly low. Barriers to enter the market are low. And in parts of the world, this could be exacerbated by regulatory immaturity and perhaps inconsistent monitoring. It presents an opportunity for attractive profit margins, which people may use that money for personal financial gain, but they may also be using it to fund further criminal activity, which of course is a problem in itself. And the literature, there's reports that it's a relatively low criminal venture, so with relatively minor legal and financial consequences for the criminals. So what I don't want you to think is that no one's doing anything about this. So the European Anti-Fraud Office runs an annual operation which they call Silver Acts, and the purpose of that is to identify and seize counterfeit or substandard agrochemicals. It's across Europe and it involves many EU member states. And what it involves is performing checks at the point of entry, so seaports and land borders, for example, as well as inspecting and checking products at packaging, production and repackaging facilities. And in the bottom left there, you can see past results, and clearly there's an increase in the quantity of chemical product being seized. And the reason for this is possibly because the authorities are getting better at spotting it, but also that the quantity of substandard chemical is increasing. And it's probably the trend seen there in that chart is probably as a result of both of those things together. The important thing to note here, though, is that all of the work that Operation Silver Acts does is based on prior intelligence, so like tip-offs, but also looking very hard for discrepancies in paperwork and tracking information. What they don't have is a way of testing on-site to confirm the legitimacy of a product. So we really started this project by trying to understand the problem, and we started with this relatively simple outline of where we saw chemical products being used. And so we thought, well, you have farmers and growers, they spread pesticides onto their crops. Those crops are then harvested and packaged and sent to retailers, and those retailers eventually send them to consumers like me and you. Alongside this, there is some people involved in this. So there is farmers and growers are subjected to food standards schemes like Red Tractor and Global Gap, and the farmers and growers can be accredited by those people, and part of that is understanding their chemical use. Farmers and growers will also not just use a pesticide, they'll have independent consultants that will tell them what pesticide they should use this year to counter the current bugs that would be a problem for their crop. Retailers will also liaise with these independent consultants because they want to know what types of chemicals are being used. Some retailers will send samples of their produce to laboratories to look at residual testing to ensure that that is within acceptable safe limits before they're able to sell it to the consumer. So whilst this is the beginning, it's by no means the end. And so we started to think about, okay, so where do pesticides come from? Well, farmers and growers buy them from pesticide distributors, and the chemicals themselves come from branded pesticide manufacturers who sell what we'll call branded products. and manufacturers who produce what we'll call generic brands. So the way this has been described to me is that imagine this one here would be something like Nurofen, that is the branded product that everyone sees the adverts for on TV. And the generic brand would be something like a supermarket owned ibuprofen. So both of those products have the same active ingredient, but the other things in those products are different, and generally there's a fairly large price difference between the two as well. Regardless of what these products are, they must be approved for use by the Health and Safety Executive in the UK. And there is also the possibility of these products entering the supply chain legitimately from the original manufacturer, but also that these products can enter the market through what's called parallel import. And so this is where a product has been produced by the manufacturers for another global market, maybe another country, but a pesticide distributor in the UK may go and buy that, import it, repackage it, and sell it on as the UK product. And that is fine, that's totally legitimate. Perhaps the potential for parallel import into the UK has been closed by Brexit, but there's still a bit of a question mark over Northern Ireland and how things are going to work there. But of course, it's still a problem. It's still a potential thing to happen in other parts of the world. So when I talked about importing, of course, the first people that these chemicals will come into contact with is the border agency. And they do their intelligence and document checking, of course. And they will see products that have been directly imported from manufacturers as well as these parallel imports. And I mentioned that one thing that happens with the parallel imports is that they're repackaged into UK packaging or European packaging. But this step here is particularly vulnerable to counterfeiting, if you like. You know, this is where you could really insert, a substandard chemical quite easily. So we use this as a way of thinking about, okay, if we made a screening system, where would it fit into this diagram, into this fairly complicated scheme? And the answer is, well, you could imagine it being a tool that gets deployed with border agencies. So along with their normal document checking, they also do some screening. It could be with the pesticide distributors because they are the people that would receive chemicals in bulk and have got a good chance of catching it. And maybe even it could be deployed with farmers and growers, particularly if we have really large scale farmers and growers who order an awful lot of product. They are very likely to be the ones who would notice something out of place. So if we thought about developing a screening tool, what we really want to do is to try and think about what that wants to do. So there's this sort of set of requirements that we've written. We want it to be able to check the validity of a product, and that could be in either, when it's in bulk at a port or a warehouse, or at the point of delivery, which might be, sort of a farm depot or at the farm prior to spraying. And what we want to be able to produce to do this is some kind of screening technology, but it's got to fit a certain criteria. It's got to be simple and compact. It's got to provide a rapid result, and that result has to be material specific. So it needs to be able to tell the difference between real chemical and counterfeit, for example. It should, as best as possible, not require any specialist training or knowledge to use it, and should require zero sample preparation. It should work through the container, really. And the reason for this is that as soon as you open one of these chemicals, you've clearly got a chemical handling hazard, but also there's a suggestion that could be a break in the evidence chain, which would be problematic as well. It should provide a red-green response. It's like a go, no-go decision. And ideally, it would be something that's sort of connected, so that there's a database, and as new chemicals are approved for use in the UK, that gets added to the database and it stays up to date. So before we went on to identify what technologies we were going to look at, we developed our own test set, and we started initially with chemicals that we could get easily. So these were home and garden grade pesticides. And then a little while into the project, we were lucky enough to be given some small quantities of genuine plant protection products, so the kinds that would actually be used to spread on crops on farmers' fields. And we prepared a test set where we adulterated these pure samples with water as a way of simulating some sort of substandard material. And so we had 3 levels of dilution: 0%, so the pure original product, 25% water or 50% water by volume. And the reason for doing this is that dilution by water is controllable and reproducible, and it was achievable in the relatively short time scales that we had available in the project. And we were also fortunate then to partner up with Dr. Ehrenstorfer, and LGC were kind enough to provide us with references of the active ingredients for the products that we were looking at. So, as I mentioned, we were looking at assembling a list of techniques that we could bring to bear on this problem. We wanted to look particularly at technologies that could be miniaturized and made portable, and with the potential to work through the container. So techniques we looked at was Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy, ultrasound, Raman spectroscopy. We looked at X-ray imaging and X-ray fluorescence and optical spectroscopy. Unfortunately, in this case, the X-ray techniques did not provide any particularly useful signature, but we did them because we had easy access to that equipment. So we looked first at FTIR, which I think is largely sort of considered one of the gold standard techniques for this kind of investigation. And what we can see is that we get a spectrum like this, and we have lots of peaks. We can see that we get, as the concentration of water is increased, we end up with this signal increasing here between around about 3,500, 3,600 wave numbers. And we also get a signature out here, and this feature and this feature seems to change with water content. What you can also see here is that the spectrum includes peaks due to the active ingredient. So at the same time, we measured the standards that have been provided to us by Dr. Ehrenstorfer, and you can see that these are marked with the dotted lines, and we can see some peaks that align that are due to the active ingredients. It's also possible to see some peaks in here that are associated with the carrier. So this is the everything else that's in the sample that's not the active ingredient. So based on this, you can visually see the difference, but we did a quantitative approach where we looked at the difference between the proper pesticide sample and the adulterated ones, and we've displayed that as a percentage difference here. And these are 3 different materials. So we've got a fungicide, an insecticide, and a weed killer. And you can see that the percentage difference is statistically valid if you look at the error bars here. So and we would expect FTIR to perform well. Yeah. So we then moved on to look at Raman spectroscopy, and the reason for looking at this is because there are already a number of handheld Raman devices that are out on the market. The one thing that we found was that the home and garden products were fine to look at here using what would be considered kind of the default Raman instrument, which operates at a laser wavelength of 785 nanometers. But for the plant protection products, they were quite strongly coloured, and that meant that we needed to operate at a slightly larger wavelength, which is non-standard, but nonetheless is an accepted laser wavelength to use. And again, you can see that there's some variation here, mainly in terms of the magnitude of the signal with respect to increasing water content. The one thing here, though, is that perhaps doing some deeper analysis of the spectral shape, so relative changes in peak positions or shapes or magnitudes, might give you greater discrimination still. So optical light spectroscopy, this was done in transmission mode using wavelengths between 400 and 1000 nanometers. It is useful for looking at visual differences in samples, so slight variations in colour, which may be expected when it becomes diluted. But a lot of the samples were so strongly coloured that we ended up with complete absorption. So we didn't get a fantastic result out of the optical spectroscopy, unfortunately. But nonetheless, where we did get some results, we can see that we still observe some difference between the legitimate product and the adulterated. Probably the most surprising, but maybe the most useful technique here has been ultrasound. So because we're in a medical physics department, we've got easy access to ultrasound imaging systems of the type that you would find in a hospital. And what we can see being measured here is that we had small cylindrical containers of the product. And here we can see the ultrasound image through the bottle. And so what we see here is this feature here at the top and this feature at the bottom, and they are the walls of the container. So you can see it's roughly circular, as you would expect. These features in the middle are sort of additional reflections, artifacts. But what we can do is we can measure the distance between these walls. So this is not the physical distance, this is the distance as determined by the time it takes for the sound wave to travel through the material inside the bottle. And what you can see is that if we have the pure sample here and an adulterated sample here that now has some amount of water content, we can see that the determined distance, so the effective distance between the walls changes. And that's because the speed of sound for the product inside the bottle changes. So you could use this as a non-invasive way of determining whether you've got the material that you think you should have inside the bottle. And you can see here that we get actually really quite robust differences and variations. So ultrasound looks like it's a good way of being able to do this. And almost certainly ultrasound imaging like this is overkill. So there's real potential for reducing the footprint of a system that works on ultrasound. So of course, some future activities that we want to be able to do. Well, of course, we continue to seek funding to develop a demonstrator system. We would like to continue to build our network. So we already understand this is a complicated sort of situation, but we want to try and understand a bit more who is impacted by this and who are the major players. You know, we've got a good handle on it, but there must be more people. We're interested in joining with companies who would be willing to support our research. We've already had some of that, of course, but expanding that network would be good. And that help, I mean, it'd be great if it could be in the form of funding, either direct or join us as a partner on a grant, for example, but also the possibility of sort of in-kind support, so provision of samples as an example. So here's some logos of some people that have helped us already, some companies that have helped us already. Thank you to them, and thank you to you, and I'll pass back to Kelly.
Thank you, Rob. That was fascinating to hear about, so thank you for giving up your time to go through that. For anybody that is interested in reading more about this issue, there is a policy brief on the challenges of preventing counterfeit goods that's available from the Dawes Centre of Future Crime at UCL. We also have a wide range of Dr. Ehrenstorfer white papers that are covering not only the pesticide analysis, but other compounds related to our portfolio and how to regulate them. And we also, of course, have our catalogue available with all of our reference materials available, including those that are featured in this study. And at this point, I'm now going to invite the panel members to turn on their cameras and unmute themselves, and we'll begin our panel discussion. Just a reminder to the audience that you can submit your questions through the menu on the right-hand or left-hand side of your screen, depending on where you've put it. And just to get started, I'm just going to go around the panel members and ask if they would just briefly introduce themselves. Rob, I'll let you off as you've already introduced yourself, but if we go to Professor Robert Speller first, please.
Hi, Kelly, thanks for that. Yeah, I'm Robert Speller. I'm an emeritus professor of physics applied to medicine at UCL. My main area of expertise is in fact X-ray, so maybe if something comes up in that area, I would be able to answer it.
Okay, and Richard Byrne?
Hi, Richard Byrne from Harper Adams. I run the Rural Security Research Group at Harper Adams, which is an organisation which looks at rural crime, farm crime, and all those sort of areas of crime involved in the food chain.
Thank you. And Martin?
Thank you, Kelly. My name's Martin Hare. I'm a lecturer at Harper Adams University. I used to work for a couple of chemical manufacturing companies. That's a long time ago now, but I've always been linked to pesticide work with the industry and pesticide technology teaching here at the university.
And JC?
Yeah, my name is JC. I'm a researcher in UCL. So my main research work is mainly using opticals and X-rays techniques in material detections. So I'm the researcher is also working in this project as well.
Okay, thank you. And Shane, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Kelly. I'm a professor at University College London. I direct the Dawes Centre for Future Crime, which funded the work that Rob was talking about. Thank you.
Thank you. And last but by no means least, Jens, if you'd like to introduce yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Jens. I'm working in Augsburg as the head of product development. I'm responsible for all the new product development, for production planning of all of our Dr. Ehrenstorfer catalog parts produced in Augsburg, Charleston, and in Nanjing in China.
Wonderful, thank you. So I'm going to get started as we have had a few questions submitted already, and I've also got a couple of my own. But I guess starting with the biggest and vaguest question of them all is just how big of a problem is this? Richard, would you care to comment on that one? Richard, we appear to have lost your sound a little bit, sorry.
It's one of those questions which is, how long is a piece of string, really? Rob mentioned Operation Silver Axe. That's been going on for the last few years in Europe, and some of their raids and interdictions are really quite large. So in June 21, was something like 1,200 tons of illegal products seized, worth about 80 million euro, and we think that's very much the tip of the iceberg. In Europe, it's generally considered about 10% of the market could be counterfeit in one of the various stages of counterfeit, from being adulterated to be out and out faked. But this varies around the world. So in parts of particularly West Africa, the propensity to find counterfeit chemicals or chemicals which have been adulterated, generally watered down, is a lot higher without that regulatory framework around them. What we are aware of is this is a growing problem, and that the criminals are very, very adept at getting up to speed where there's a need within the market. So a few years ago, there was an issue with flea beetle and oilseed rape. It was quite a widespread issue, and very quickly across Europe, we started to see counterfeit chemicals to meet that need, because farmers were going to the for the merchants and buying it, and there was a temporary shortage, and the criminals filled that void, as it were. But yeah, it's something we're learning about all the time.
And you spoke to the size of the problem in Europe in terms of, you know, accounting for what 10% of the economy there. Do you have a view on how big a size of the economy it is for other regions? Is the EU that where it's, you know, the most recorded, and that's why we've got that value, and we don't have a view of other regions, say?
We very much know more about it within the EU and the periphery of the EU, because we do have a framework, a regulatory framework, and we do have things like Operation Silver Axe. There's various estimates. If this was a business, it would be probably something like the 4th or 5th largest company in the world. That's the scale of counterfeit pesticides. If you think about them, these are very, very high value products. They might be small in package size, but very, very high value products. And apart from Antarctica, every continent uses them to a lesser or greater extent. So this is a truly global industry with very high demand, and also one where there's a lot of innovation. So it's very, very hard for people often to keep up with the new branding or the new chemicals or the new formulations, because it's one where the industry is very, very active and very, very good at developing new formulations. And that unfortunately leaves open an area of unfamiliarity with some of the packaging in particular, which means that people often pick up things which look similar but aren't actually the product they actually are actually paying for.
Okay. And just out of interest, has the UK leaving the EU changed the situation at all for us, or is it very much the same as it was previously?
To some extent, the parallel import market has been altered, but we still obviously have a land border with the EU through Northern Ireland. We also don't have as many border checks at the main points of entry, so there's always an issue with this material coming in. And we do know from raids in Germany that this material often, the composite parts of the material don't come in often looking like agrochemicals. They come in as looking like something else or badged as something else. And in fact, one of the biggest fines, accidental fines actually in Germany, was a traffic stop with a HGV. And the only reason the police officer's suspicion was raised was the fact there was a lot of packaging cartons stacked alongside these generic vessels of chemicals within the wagon, and the police officer wanted to find out why they were having the packaging but not the products in the packaging. And this was a counterfeit operation coming out of Eastern Europe.
And
Kelly?
yes, Martin.
Sorry, if I just add to that point and pick up on something that Rob mentioned when he was talking, that in Great Britain, the parallel trade permit system will cease on the 31st of December of this year, 2022. So products entering into Great Britain will not be able to come through that route. But because Northern Ireland's remaining aligned to the EU system, then that route is still open for Northern Ireland. So I think the question about, you know, how does Brexit affect the UK? I think it potentially will affect Great Britain differently to Northern Ireland. So, but we'll have to see what really happens there, you know, and the reduction of this ability for things to coming through parallel trade permits to GB.
Okay, and with that reduction in those parallel imports, that would reduce the issue potentially in Great Britain, or?
Well, what it would do, it would stop that route that Rob mentioned, where somebody can legally bring pesticide into the country and repackage it. And it's that ability to bring something in and then repackage it, which gives an opportunity for a counterfeit product to then move legitimately, I can use that, into the supply chain.
Okay. So in general, what kind of chemicals are mostly counterfeited? Are there kind of repeat suspects that come up a lot more often than, say, other chemicals within the agrochemical industry? And I don't know who wants to jump in on that one, Richard or Martin.
It's interesting. It depends on the sector, but one of the most counterfeited one is Monsanto's Roundup, or what he was Monsanto's Roundup, even though that's available as generic across many manufacturers now. It's still very, very highly counterfeited or adulterated. Why? It's still a relatively expensive chemical in developing nations. It's a very useful chemical. It's used across a lot of sectors. So we tend to find the ones that are most counterfeited are for two sectors. One is the cereal sector in terms of particularly wheat, but also for oilseeds. Those are the ones that you tend to see a lot more counterfeits, but they have been found in quite niche areas, and those niche areas are being exploited because they're high value. So citrus fruits. There was a case in India not many years ago, about 3 years ago, where the state buyer actually purchased counterfeit citrus fruit and apple pesticide and contaminated the whole state's crop. And that was a huge blow to the production of apples from the area and citrus fruit, and for the economy and for the farmers themselves. So it's also very cyclical. So like I said, with the flea beetle incident with oilseed rape, when we get the right weather conditions and there's a demand, that's where we see these companies moving in very quickly to fill that void. They're very, very adept, and it's a real characteristic of an organised crime group that they see opportunity, and this is a very, very low risk activity, criminal activity in reality, because going back to the example in Germany, it was only because the police officer thought it was curious the packaging was separate from the chemical that he impounded the vehicle and did further investigations. But in general, most border officers, most police services, it's a collection of materials of an industrial nature on pallets, and we don't really have a wider awareness of counterfeiting in terms of pesticides. When we think about counterfeiting, we think about things like sportswear and DVDs and pirated material like that. And we don't tend to focus on those things which sort of slip under the radar, and that's very much why this is a low risk, high value criminal activity.
Okay, and obviously some of the criminals will formulate stuff based on emerging kind of crop protection needs, so sort of outbreaks of like aphids and that kind of thing. If we've got these counterfeit products that essentially have the same active substances as the genuine product, will they actually work as well as the genuine products, or will there be like side effects that we're not aware of? And Martin, I'm going to ask you to jump in on that one, please.
Okay, Kelly. I think it's a difficult question to ask categorically by saying yes they will or no they won't. I think the way that I would answer this by saying just because a product has the same active substance in it doesn't mean that it will work to the same extent and be as efficacious. The activity that you get from a pesticide product is not just down to the active substance, but it's how it's formulated. So if the formulation is different, then the likelihood is there will be some difference in efficacy. And also, just having the correct amount of active substance doesn't again mean that it's going to work the same, because it could be the form that active substance is in that could have an effect on efficacy. If we're thinking about solid particles in suspension, in what's known as suspension concentrate formulation, the size of those particles, how finely they've been milled, could affect biological efficacy as well. So I think the real answer is that unless you're dealing with an identical product, there will be a difference. It's how different that's going to be, and whether it's going to be noticed on farm in that regard as well. And this comes back to a point that Richard made about, this is a good area for criminals to go at, because if you apply a fungicide, for example, how do you know that it's given you the level of efficacy that you'd expect unless it really doesn't work at all? And it just reminds me of a case when I was given a watch many, many years ago, and it was a Cartier watch. It wasn't really. It was a counterfeit watch that someone had bought in the Far East. What I did subsequently learn, though, is that it had citizen workings, and it was a really good watch. It worked fine, you know, it kept really good time, but it wasn't what it said on the tin. If I'd have paid the money for a Cartier watch, I would have been very annoyed because it wasn't what it said, you know. So if a farmer's paying the top market price for a product and that's not what they're getting, you know, clearly that's not right. If it's a good counterfeit, they may not notice.
Okay.
Something I would like to add in here, if you allow me, Kelly.
Yeah, of course.
It's not only the pesticide didn't do the function as well. So some counterfeit pesticide, if they do the functions, they might provide more residual pesticide at the end of the products. This resulting in the products was pulled out from the in terms of, let's say, the resellers. So this will be even a blow to the farmer as well.
Right.
Yeah,
so
JC makes, sorry, Kelly, JC makes a good point there. I mean, I was answering your question with regard to, you know, how well they would work, but really it brings into question everything about that product, because products won't go on sale, certainly within the EU or the UK and most other countries in the world, unless they've passed the regulatory process. So they've been tested not just on how they work, in particular in Europe, that's the case, but their effect on the operator, on consumers, on the environment, and all of that's brought into question if the product isn't what it says, you know, what it really should be.
yeah, I think that was going to be my next question is, you know, what kind of dangers there might be for the consumers and for environmental health? Because obviously, even with your legitimate pesticides, right, you have, you know, directions for use. We have maximum residual limits that we need to measure to make sure that they're safe for consumers and for the environment. Obviously, you know, counterfeit or illegal pesticides are not going to be subject to those same kind of rigorous standards, right? So what would that added danger potentially look like?
Well, I wouldn't want anyone on the call to suddenly get really, really worried about this, because again, you know, if we're talking about a counterfeit that's a really good counterfeit, then it could be that there's differences to the product, but nothing that's going to make, you know, the operator ill, you know, and end up in hospital or something like that. But we don't know is the answer. You know, it could. What we know is that it's not going to be what we think it is. So, you know, it could be that it's unsafe for the operator. If it's a formulation which is using chemicals which are not as safe, I mean the co-formulants within there, and it's labelled as the genuine product, the operator may not wear some personal protective clothing that they really should, given what's in the container. And that could lead to a potential health effect. The same would be true with consumers as well. You know, it is possible for this to be the case, and with the environment as well. You know, effects on pesticides entering into water courses, groundwater, or effects on wildlife.
Yeah, of course. Because obviously we were saying within those illegal pesticides, not just the counterfeits that, you know, potentially mimic really well what the legitimate one does, but there was also mention of banned and unauthorized like compounds within there as well. So if a criminal enterprise is bringing those to the market, they're obviously going to pose a danger to health to everyone because they've been banned and unauthorized for a reason, right? So I think that's more the focus I was taking with that question. Sorry, Martin, I wasn't so specific, but.
And Kelly, that's an issue very much in the developing economies where we are seeing substitution of a modern branded chemical with a older chemical. Very often either it's been banned or withdrawn, not necessarily banned completely, but withdrawn from the EU or North America. And because somebody has an amount of this product, it is then rebadged and sold somewhere in the developing world. And that's where we see that sort of those potentials for when it was manufactured, it met regulatory standards. It no longer meets those standards, but it's now being used, and that has an impact on health, Martin said, on the ecosystem. But it also then damages those countries because they struggle then to import goods into the large markets they want to, like the EU and North America, because they fail the regulatory standards. And that is a problem that crops up ever so often with these resales and repackaging of what is a very expensive product at the end of the day.
Yeah. And Rob, I guess the detection device that you're putting together, will that also detect these banned substances too?
Well, I get that is kind of a hard question to answer without actually making the measurements, but I guess what we've always been looking for here is a material specific fingerprint. So if it's not the material, if we look at the label and it says it should be agrochemical A, then if our measurement gives us a result that means that it's not, it doesn't look like agrochemical A, then that would be the first step in screening. The next step would be, okay, this is something suspicious, and you would follow the normal route of reporting it to HSE in this country, for example, and then there would be the laboratory testing and such like to work out exactly what it is.
Okay, so the detection device would almost, I guess, streamline which samples you would actually send for analysis and which samples maybe look okay, to kind of, I don't know, optimize that process.
Yeah, and I think that what it's about is screening. It's not about identifying the material. It's about saying it's not what it appears to be. It's not what the label says it should be, or it's not what the shipping manifest says it should be. And then that would then activate the next level of investigation.
Okay, so then at that point, when it goes to the lab, that's when I guess things like the certified reference materials come in, and then your other analytical chemical techniques. Jens, I don't know if you'd like to comment here on where CRMs fit in and that kind of that extra sort of identification and quantification step that would follow from something like this.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you mentioned that already in your introduction that we have quite a long history of producing reference materials and certified reference materials. So all our production sites are accredited reference material producer according to ISO 70034, and the majority of our products is accredited to ISO 70034. If it is neat materials, if it is single solution, if it is mixtures that are needed or used by our customers to either calibrate their analytical instruments, they can be used for method validation, and also to identify compounds. I mean, we are looking more and more into more sensitive analytical measurements and methods. So we're doing, or our customers doing non-target screening, for example, so they can use our reference materials to identify signals they have seen not before, and they are not sure which compounds they are dealing with. So yeah, there are multiple purposes. Our reference materials can be used by our customers, and due to our accreditation, they can have a high confidence that the identity, the purity, or for mixtures and single solutions, the concentrations are valid. And yeah.
So we'd have Rob detecting on his end that we've got something that's suspicious, and then on our end we would have obviously that identification process to see just how dangerous that compound potentially is, and obviously how to take that out of circulation. Rob, I know that you looked at kind of a handful of techniques. There are obviously a lot of different techniques that you could employ to a project like this. Why did you select the ones that you have in your study?
Yeah, again, it was really about being able to look for techniques that could give us a very rapid result, and a result that is material specific. And we also tried to focus on techniques that have the potential to be shrunk down, miniaturized, simplified. And there were some techniques which just wouldn't fit that bill. You know, you could use a technique like mass spectrometry, but you know, they tend to be fairly large pieces of kit. I mean, I know that there's some portable ones, but they tend to require special sample preparation. These are all things that really couldn't be tolerated, and it wouldn't be a rapid turnaround.
So it's about ease of implementation. And I think you said that you were going to be targeting this device at like customs authorities where, you know, border control are coming in to detect those imports and exports. Would that same handheld device be appropriate for, say, distributors to use or for farmers to use?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that eventually comes down to cost versus amount of product you want to scan. So it might, you know, if it met all the criteria but it was relatively expensive, then maybe having some at a port would be all right, because they see thousands of tons of this kind of product every year. But for an individual farmer to buy that screening tool for the fact that they spread, you know, insecticide on their field once a year, it might be a bit of an ask. But if it was made cheap, you know, and accessible, then there's no reason it couldn't be deployed all the way along the chain.
Brilliant. I'm conscious that we are running out of time, unfortunately, because I'd love to carry on talking about this a bit longer. I just want to give the panel members a chance to potentially any last sort of closing remarks they'd like to make. If not, I will move on to closing the panel. Okay. On that note, I'd like to thank all of our panel members today for giving up their time to come and talk to us and share their expertise. And thank you to everybody that has attended this event. As mentioned previously, there will be a recording made available afterwards, and any questions that we weren't able to answer in this panel, we will follow up with afterwards. And for anybody that would like to get in touch, we do have all the panel members' contact details here, and we also have the UCL and LGC social pages and websites for anybody that wants to reach out for further content or advice. And on that note, I'd like to thank you all for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of day.